Hello and welcome to DigFin VOX, Voices in Digital Finance. I'm your host, Jame DiBiasio. If you enjoy the program, like, subscribe, let the algorithm know. My guest today is Monica Jasuja, a fintech specialist with experience as diverse as PayPal, MasterCard, and GoTo. Monica spoke with me about what makes payments in Asia so distinct, interesting, and challenging. From regulation to digital banking, to financial inclusion, and all the way to what's going to happen to the valuations of these technology companies. Monica Jasuja, welcome to DigFin VOX.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you and your audience.
It's great to have you. I'm looking forward to this conversation because I feel like I'm going to learn a lot by speaking with you today. You have been a veteran in the fintech and payments world. India, Indonesia, Singapore, USA. You've kind of ticked a lot of boxes in what's happening. So why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit? I know your current role is at GoTo in Jakarta, but you seem to be moving around a lot. So why don't you sort of explain a little bit about your background and some of the big things that you've worked on, and then we can dive into what's relevant today and what people should be looking for around the corner.
Absolutely. Thank you again for the opportunity. I'm a product manager, actually a software engineer turned product manager. Started my career in product management with a mobile solutions company and then moved on to PayPal. Almost ventured into it and stumbled by mistake, where I started off with consumer payments and pretty much did most of consumer payments based in 3 locations where I moved around between Chennai, Singapore, and the United States. Worked on most of the consumer payment related front end activities associated with money movement in PayPal before I transitioned into MasterCard in India and South Asia, leading the digital payments division and then the strategic partnerships vertical, which was set up to interact and work with the fintechs before I moved to Tech Mahindra Comviva, which is a leading solution provider for mobile money solutions and digital banking across the world. And then into GoTo Financial, leading the charter for consumer payments again, this time on the money management side. I'm also a fintech thought leader, recognized in terms of how I share content on social media, and of course try to keep up on both trends that are happening and what is probably going to happen a little bit further into the future, which we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that introduction. I think that gives people a pretty good idea of the breadth of your activities and experience. So when we're looking at payments, maybe you can talk with your current job. So you're helping GoTo with the money management side of that for GoPay. I guess their in-app mobile wallet. What are some of the problems? GoTo is Indonesia's champion. What are some of the problems or the challenges that they needed you to help them figure out? And maybe talk us a little bit about sort of where we're at with these giant super app type companies in terms of what they're doing with payments.
So, Jim, what is really interesting is that in Southeast Asia, most of the challenges that are coming in the digitization and providing financial services to the larger populace is really not coming in terms of lack of access or lack of intention. So the right technology levers exist. Obviously, the right people are working in the right places to make these technology solutions become accessible to the larger population. I think the difference here lies in both the supply side of the problem as well as the demand side, but mostly the demand side. Now, one can address the supply side by being able to use both government levers as well as technology to help with the infrastructure being available. But in terms of the demand, we have to remember that the purchasing parity as well as the consumers in terms of how much they're willing to spend and how much they do actually engage with payments based on their spending power is extremely limited. So in most of these countries, we are trying to address solutions which will help cater both, first of all, catering to the top 1 to 10% of the population and then percolate down the pyramid. That's one way of looking at this. The second is obviously creating the right kind of consumer habits and behaviors to inculcate the change so that users stop using cash and move to digital methods. So I think that is overriding.
Yeah, so we hear a lot about digital economy, and we see these incredible companies in whether it's Indonesia or in Thailand or Malaysia or India. Yet these are cash economies still at heart. So when you're talking about that demand side, you're talking about whether it's merchants or consumers, people who want to use digital wallets or other forms of interaction rather than cash. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. And consumers and merchants both have a habit which has been built over like centuries, not even years right now.
Right.
And it's very difficult for them to change or adopt something which is obviously faster, better, perhaps may or may not be cheaper, but is a much better experience for them. They don't take into the convenience part of our pitch. They normally take into how it enables to either move their business or adds value to their life. And I think that's where the problem and solution space lies for these kind of economies, as well as both digital as well as physical.
It consultants or people from this industry, obviously we're all very bullish on what's happening, and financial inclusion is a big long-term trend, which I think people are happy about. Yet the reality is, if I may parse through a little bit of what you're saying, is that it's a lot harder than it looks, and uptake is not always as easy or rosy as perhaps some of these reports might lead us to believe. So where's the reality right now? Like, whether it's in Indonesia or India or other markets, like how optimistic should we be about rapid consumer adoption of digital means of payments and other activities around that?
So I have to be. I'm not going. I'm going to say it as it is. I think most analysts over predicted what was going to happen post COVID, and the reality check has already been felt, and it's been felt over multiple levers that have been used in the recent last 6 to 8 months in terms of being able to correct that perception as well as the trend. Having said that, I think consumers have tasted blood in terms of being able to understand what it is to be on the other side. A lot of consumers are going to continue to stick to those habits, but what you're seeing in terms of this extra big opportunity layer has to be balanced against what we are going to see on the ground, as well as the reality in terms of purchasing power. I have to come back to this, but the number of consumers who used to use online can now completely get all the services that they wanted online, offline, and with pretty much literally no convenience fees. I think it's very hard to then be able to provide value to them for which they're willing to pay. And if many of these services continue to be free, then it's hard to be able to create a profitable roadmap in terms of both monetization capabilities of this large consumer base, as well as the ability to cross sell products. And I think this is where most people are struggling. And
Yeah.
this is a common problem in this part of the world, which doesn't happen anywhere else, which is why it's very difficult for people outside to understand.
So the issue, Monica, is that these companies have had to provide offers that are not really sustainable just to get people to use these apps and services. And I guess during COVID, there was this huge rush to use them. But these are, and at the same time, the end of COVID kind of coincides with the end of the whole VC funded model of buying eyeballs, right? So we're getting a double whammy of people retreating from these just because they don't have to use digital if they don't want to. And I guess for a lot of these digital companies, the VC money tap is narrowing. So is that kind of where we're at with a lot of these companies?
Yes, in 2020, the focus was all on organic growth, which was happening because it was COVID and everybody was inside. 2021 saw a huge amount of, first of all, infusion of VC funding, as well as the focus on being able to create more and more consumers who were taking to digital. And 2022 has all been about being able to manage these users into creating a sustainable base of both loyal users as well as monthly active. So when you see that the goalpost hasn't changed, but how you define the success of a and therefore your playbook has actually been modified. And exactly to your point, if you're trying to buy consumers because you need to be able to obviously not it's not about throwing money only, it's also about being able to tell them about your service you are going to spend on marketing. When you need to reduce that kind of spending and actually focus on being making these users profitable, which means having them use your services and not just one but many, that's where the focus area completely changes. And that is what has happened over late 2022 and now, where there is a lot of dry money in the system. However, it's not available for these large kind of companies. It's mostly for early stage or series A and B.
Okay. And that marketing spend is only one aspect of how big tech companies would attract users. There's also then financial incentives like cashbacks and these sorts of things. Are people still able to uh, prove a value proposition that they can charge money for rather than giving money for?
Absolutely. And I think this is another change that has happened. People, especially consumers who are not, it's not about being savvy
Mhm.
about using these particular products, but being able to see the value in the product being made available to them versus if it didn't exist in their lives. And I think those are the number of users who are actually going to help propel the digital economy forward. And therefore the loyal, the monthly active, and the annual active users have become a metric that VCs are living by, and the focus is again to create consumer behavior change, which is obviously founded on basic salient principles, first principles as we call them in product management, but also their ability to want to pay for these services. And I
Yeah.
think that's something that we are seeing across the board. And this is, by the way, not only happening in Southeast Asia, but even in India, where the cashbacks have completely dried up.
Yes. What in your experience works? Like what makes a digital product and the payment side that goes with it stick?
That is a very, very difficult question. But I will say this: if you're solving a real solution problem,
Mhm.
which people and which is either consumers or businesses need, then they're going to be willing to first of all use it. Then they're willing to be able to pay for it. I say this because sometimes we are throwing solutions at consumers that they don't even need. And there are a lot of examples that we can find, especially in this part of Asia, where the geographical distribution of both consumers as well as businesses is very, very diverse, and the same rule that applies to the Western world doesn't apply to third world countries or even to the developing world. And that is where I think the change happens, because if you keep throwing these really amazing solutions which look really great but do a very basic job, then nobody's going to be willing to pay for them. And a classic case that comes to my mind is the case for digital banking slash neobanking slash challenger banks versus not. There are plenty of reports which have indicated and have done in complete insights based on P&Ls that have been reported in financial statements, where even the banks that exist in Europe are not able to prove their financial worth. Now, the question is, if you get this model to Asia, Asia already has banking systems. They already have the concept of physical branches and trust being in physical. You can't displace the model overnight when the only value prop is something which is free that they can get because the governments are offering. And we didn't talk about a very important lever, which is very proactive in this part of the world, which is governments. Governments are the main disruptors. They are the ones who are actually pushing not only the agenda to make payments commoditized by pushing the rates down, but they are actually creating an environment in which local companies thrive. They're creating an environment in which they push the agenda, saying, "I want the payment, I want the cost of cross-border payments to go down. This is what you need to do." In this environment, then fintechs are merely and majorly providing the ability to obviously showcase the best use cases with the most innovative way of being able to manage them, the best user experience and differentiation. Now, this is again, this almost reverses the paradigm of what fintechs do across the world, and it places the emphasis on government regulation, finding and creating the safeguards and ring rails in which fintechs operate. And this is something which is a little difficult for people outside to understand.
Yes, I mean we've seen different examples of that. Even in Hong Kong, where I'm based, most of the fintech advances here have been because the HKMA has, sort of forced the banks to do faster payments or has licensed virtual banks to come in and compete. And we see when they have kind of wishy-washy standards or guardrails, then nothing happens basically.
Absolutely. And
Now,
a brilliant case in point is UPI and
yeah,
even Singapore. And the connection that is happening now, it was, used, it was just launched by the PMs of both the countries. I think it's a primary example. Then there's Project Nexus, there's the RTP connectivity, which is happening in this part of the world. So there are plenty of things around which are basically indicating that the playbook has suddenly changed.
yeah. The numbers, the types of users that big tech companies and the payment side are going after in the region, you said the top sort of 10% of, I guess, people with consumer spending power. That to me is a very narrow high number, and a narrow number in the sense that that sounds like the kind of base that a bank or a traditional incumbent would cater to, rather than somebody who's trying to be disruptive and going down the pyramid of wealth, and finding the underserved. So what is the reality that you see on the ground, whether it's with GoTo or in India, in terms of being able to actually do financial inclusion, really expand services and financing opportunities to people that have never used this before, or have been excluded, or just had a raw deal because they didn't have the paperwork or the wealth to back up what they wanted to do?
So, Jim, the primary responsibility for this kind of inclusion actually lies with the governments. And the reason I say this is because only they are able to create both policy as well as financial backing and support to be able to serve the underserved. I feel that we carry a huge burden of both responsibility and accountability, however, to the people to make sure that financial services are available for everyone, which is in terms of both access as well as ease. However, the burden cannot be carried by us alone, which is why in this part of the world where there is the maximum number of underbanked, after Africa, of course. But if you take each one of the countries in the region, the number of the underbanked is fairly significant. Therefore, at the back of both technology, payment rail innovation, social identity, I think there is almost like a playbook that gets created where financial service providers work on any or most of these building blocks to be able to take a user almost up the curve. So the user starts off with being exposed to mobile technology solutions. They are obviously starting off with gaming and video and social media on the smartphone with cheap internet access. Cheap internet can be guaranteed only by the governments, working, of course, with technology providers, but in the telco space. Then it's followed by the upgrade where they start working with physical money solutions, not sorry, e-money solutions, which is either wallets or others. And then they kind of transition over to getting a bank account and using it actively. Now, this is where I feel that fintechs need to play a part, where they're already doing it, but to be able to serve a larger audience and to serve a larger amount of people, you need to be able to also understand that it's not just about using a mobile phone. It's basic digital financial literacy, digital literacy as overall. And then if you build on top of it, the ability to spend, and there which is tied directly to their incomes. I think we need to be able to solve that part of the pillar as well, and that part of the puzzle. How do we increase their spending power, and with the spending power that they have, how do we make them save money? Which is why the digital bank licenses that have been given out in this part of the world, which are supposed to help people not only understand saving, understand investing, but understand how they need to manage their financial lives, is so critical. And if fintech is able to help this education, awareness and socialization of what they're trying to build, then I really believe that financial inclusion as a puzzle can be solved with the joint efforts of public and private partnership, which is helping first create regulation, policies around what needs to be done, and then getting all the right kind of support for the technology guys to build for that.
You're a product person. You know how to build things and design. How good are we doing at financial inclusion? When I speak with people about this, it always gets mentioned, but I'm not sure it's in the hearts of people that are commercial at, in terms of what they're trying to do. And it often I hear about gamification. And I sometimes think that gamification is, perhaps it's a blind alley, because at the end of the day, financial literacy and stuff that you do with your money is fundamentally it's kind of boring, and maybe it should stay that way. Maybe I'm just being an old fudgy duddy about that. But what's your take on product design? Using this technology, reaching people, trying to make it interactive and engaging without making it, like a casino or something inappropriate.
So I have to admit here that I think all of us can be held and be considered guilty of actually trying to promote and throwing solutions at consumers which they don't need. All of us have been guilty of that. And I'm reminded of this very important quote by Steve Blank, who said, "Get out of the building." And it's a very important process that he actually created for product managers as well as business people. Instead of trying to create within that air conditioned environment where you're trying to create these solutions which are ultra good looking, etc., you actually go and speak to consumers and customers both. Consumers, I say, because they may or may not pay for the product, and there are actual customers who may be willing to pay for the product for the end consumer that you're willing to serve. And I think it's in that learning that we realize that consumers are looking for very different things, including in payments, which we are failing to understand. So for example, and let's take the example of UPI. UPI was supposed to make these 500 million or so-called users start using digital payments. Right now, we are crossing about 250 to 300 million in India. WhatsApp was supposed to be that big tectonic moment, because WhatsApp as a social media application and India as its biggest market would have created this many number of users. I wouldn't call it a failure, but it's a use case and a case study in terms of what didn't work. So my question really is, if for the most used application in the world, we still don't have UPI being the predominant application that is being used and P2P transfers coming from WhatsApp, then what went wrong? And I think that's exactly what we need to solve for. Consumers aren't looking to use a social media application like they do in China to make transfers. They're using WhatsApp for many other things, including for business, by the way, which is great. So we need to understand what consumers are looking for, and financial inclusion per se, the hesitation to go to a bank, the hesitation to open a bank account, the hesitation to operate a bank account, the ability to not be able to understand financial terms, the ability to not be able to read what's written. These are unique problems that we have to face with the last mile delivery of solutions with the population which is beyond big cities, and that's what we're trying to address. So I think it's a long game. It's a consumer habit as well as information and knowledge building exercise. Fintechs cannot do it alone. They need the support of the government as well as banks. And banks also cannot do it alone. They need these large consumer bases which are attracted by promotions, by cashbacks, and they need for them to be able to build. So the playbook of financial service providers working, so fintechs having a bank license is something which is very, very common and big here for this exact reason.
What's the lessons that the industry can learn from the Chinese example? What are the things that is replicable, that are things that can be done elsewhere? And maybe what are some aspects of the Chinese success story that just don't translate for some reason? People might go down the wrong path if they try to sort of, just cut and paste that.
I have a perfect example because I've been studying this for a while, which is the red envelope example. I think everybody tried to copy WeChat and what they did, and it's been a colossal failure everywhere. And in fact, I believe there's a Harvard case study on this as well. So the question is, we can't blindly copy what is available and applicable in a particular country, because there are some local ethos that need to be followed. So the concept of physically giving somebody cash, especially during religious occasions and festivals, is something which is very core and intrinsic to our culture. You can't replace it by something digital. And I think this is where we go wrong. But in the China example, I think one of the major learnings has been the case of the super app, or the case of not having a super app. And there is plenty of work going on, plenty of literature available on how this may or may not succeed in Asia. But I'm very clear about one thing, that when you get a consumer, I think it's up to us also to be able to get and cross-sell them various products and services in a way that they need, based on what they are willing to spend on. So, you can't really apply one rule fits all to consumers. You need to be able to understand their interest. We are not doing such a great job of doing that by analyzing their behaviors. So the super app example, which has already been exported, is already in play. I'm sure the results will tell us whether it was a success or a failure, but we can't just throw things at consumers. Secondly, in the case of China as well, there's almost like a 90 to 95% user base which is already exposed to digital payments. So it became very easy for builders to build on top of that, because the ability to pay with a financial instrument was very easily available. So it almost reversed that. Versus in our case, we have to actually first be able to provide users the ability to pay, to take cash to a digital format, and then have them actually take over and start understanding how do you pay for things online, etc. So it's a very different ball game here, and it's a very different problem to solve. And third, that I would like to say, is that in China, the banks became active after the two players took off. I think in Asia, we are actually seeing a reverse. I believe that banks and fintechs play their game together, because banks can't do it without fintechs as well. Banks, digital games have been up because they're facing the heat from fintechs. And fintechs have been working actively with banks to be able to not only help the underserved, but also help their own consumers by providing solutions that they need. So I think this is one a difference. At the same time, I would say a learning that has come from the China example, where banks have also taken note and everybody is working together collaboratively to help
Yeah.
solve for consumers.
If you're running a big tech company and you're trying to raise capital, and you're calling yourself a super app, or that's your ambition, you're what valuation do you use? Because if you say, well, my valuation is going to be like Alibaba, then no, it's not, is it? I mean, it's just not going to happen. I mean, in Southeast Asia alone, you've got several competitors all trying to do this, whether it's Grab and GoTo or C or the banks. So this gets back, I guess, to the question of profitability and sustainability of the model. But how close to reality are we with being able to find, I guess, that right fit of valuation, profitability, sustainability?
So, Jame, I think this one definitely needs overall of how we actually evaluate businesses. If we are going to look at a publicly traded firm and then look at their current performance at the stock market, then it's taken a beating in the last 3 to 5 years, especially in the last 3 years, where the revenue multiples in terms of valuation as well as the PE ratio, etc. And again, there's so much literature written on top of this. I personally feel that how high growth companies and how tech companies are actually valued first when they are when they're just funded and they haven't gone to the public markets, and then after, seems to be something that will evolve over a period of time, and maybe at some point we'll come up with what the right metrics of evaluation are. Amazon, for example, has been a case study on how it's not been profitable, but the other services side of the business has actually helped it become one of the largest companies in the world. So, in terms of fintech, I think this is becoming really difficult with the IPO performance across the world, by the way. And it raises a lot of questions because you can see mainstream companies who are IPO'd completely take a beating versus other companies which are the same model being valued in and as decacorns. So how do you explain this huge gap in valuation versus actual performance? And I think that's not something that many of us will be able to solve
Yeah.
because the parameters seem different. But to your question, I think we need to understand that paying consumers is an extremely important metric. Users which continue to remain active are important. And last but not the least, it's important to also look at the number of transactions that you're able to generate from over a period of time. And these transactions are not the ones that are just growing organically or that you're throwing money at. They should be able to go beyond the top 2, 3, 10, 15 cities and be able to pervade bigger areas, because that's when you really know that you're making a difference. Other than that, it would just be scratching the base and the top of the pyramid and not being able to go down further.
So, Monica, last question then. Where do CBDCs and some of these high level things that central banks are looking at, I guess the Web3 crypto side on the private sector, but also driven by central bank digital currencies, are these going to be relevant to fintechs or people's lives in the near future?
Jim, that I'm not really clear about right now, and I have my reservations because I think CBDCs, the time will come. But given what I'm hearing and what I'm reading about based on the G20 finance working group, etc., I truly believe that the governments are trying to look at CBDCs for cross-border payments and trying to see how that might be a valuable and I would say technologically viable solution to be able to help with the SDG goal of reducing the cost of cross-border payments. It obviously will be used in the retail use cases as well. The wholesale CBDCs is going to be obviously based on the primers that we have read, is going to be definitely helpful to reduce the cost of operations, the cost of actually printing cash, and bring economies overall much respite from that, and therefore a lot of cost savings. But personally, I'm conflicted because the digital penetration, at least in terms of scratching the surface, being able to create this movement has already started in many of these countries. The roadmaps have been hastened because of this active anxiety to be able to do something in CBDC. But I believe it's going to be a trial and error phase until such time that that exact killer use case comes around, or there is a absolute push by the governments to focus on a couple of verticals where this use case might be more relevant. But other than that, at this point in time, there's very little to say how this would work.
So we'll see probably more though of the sort of tie-ups where like UPI being able to export to Singapore, or within ASEAN, I believe some of the countries now you can use basically your wallet, your domestic wallet, and through QRs with certain partners, you can go to other ASEAN markets and spend, and it's just straight back into your bank account.
Absolutely. I think Project Nexus is also doing that from the Bank of International Settlements. So I actually see that this side of the market has suddenly seen this huge bilateral and then multilateral tie-up that seems to be happening in Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand. And the reason for that is not only because of the cross-border traffic that happens because of travel, tourism, and other, and of course exports, but also because they have local payment systems that can be tied together. And as this becomes more and more prevalent, I think also because of RTP coming in, I think there's going to be a definite hub where a hub gets established as a regional hub where money can be exchanged and in real time. I think that would be really exciting, and that kind of overcomes the need to have alternate solutions fit into the same genre.
And what's interesting about that is it's not just a hub and spoke in and out of Singapore, for example.
Yes.
This is a network, so there isn't a center to it really. It's just creating something a bit more organic, nebulous, decentralized, but perhaps that removes some of the politics out of these things. It creates more of an identity for the region.
Oh, absolutely. I have no doubt about it. And also because these are bilateral, and sometimes they're obviously to reduce cost and to create efficiencies, there is a need to be able to have better integrations which are faster and not at a one-to-one level. But most of the push again is coming from the governments to make sure that this happens. And also the payment rails that are available, I think those are going to be exciting times, because the real-time payment connectivity will just make sure that you're able to even offer it to businesses. And again, cross-border trade with real-time payment connectivity for business use cases will be extremely exciting.
Great. Well, a lot to look forward to in the coming year. Monica, Jasuja, thank you so much for joining me at DigFin VOX.
Thank you so much for getting me on the show. Thank you.